Hello, I'm Mark Thielman with Payroll.org, and I'd like to welcome you to Global Workforce Payments Jigsaw, Mastering a World of Complexities. And I have the pleasure of introducing our speakers for today. We have Jonathan Nash, Director of Payments Expert, and Jonathan Ricetti, Head of Pre-Sale Payments, both with Papaya Global. Please welcome Jonathan and Jonathan.
Hi everyone, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. It's lovely to meet you and thank you very much for your time today. As Mark said, my name is Jonny Nash, based out of the sunny UK. Really looking forward to today's session to talk about the global payments landscape with regards to payroll. My background is in payroll payments, in particular in the industry for over 10 years, looking to solve some of the issues faced by many organizations globally on how to deliver their payroll related payments across the globe. So yeah, thank you very much for your time. Looking forward to today's session. And Jonathan, or other Jonathan, over to you.
Yeah, it's going to be complicated. So both Jonathan. So thanks, Jonny. So I'm Jonathan Ricetti. So I have vast experience in payments industry in multiple regions. So I'm actually now based out of Singapore, originally from Belgium. So I covered mostly EMEA and APAC during my career. I built most of my experience working for Swift when I got the opportunity to work on large transformation projects in the region. So I'm working on various RTGS from quite a lot of APAC countries. And I recently gained experience working on payments and e-commerce when working at Stripe over the last year. So looking forward to the session and to hopefully a useful conversation and insights that we can share with you.
Great. Thank you very much. Jonathan, Singapore Jonathan will call you for the purpose of today. Just to kind of recap on what Mark said, any questions, we would love to hear them. Please put them in the chat. We want to make this as an engaging session as possible, and we will try to stop and answer any questions proactively. But if not, we will follow up following on from this session. But yeah, any questions at all, anything you want to dive into deeper, please feel free to put those directly into the chat. Just going to move on to the agenda element here. So as we kind of mentioned, today we're focusing on the challenges faced by many global companies, which is paying a diverse workforce across different countries or a global workforce. So what we want to talk into today is not only net salary payments, so paying employees, but the complexity that comes with paying all of your payroll related payments on a country by country basis. So things like your taxes, your social security, any private pensions, meal vouchers, all sorts of payments like that, the different complexities that come with them, but also how those payments have to be made. We're going to address some of that today. We'll also be looking at some more specific examples like Brazil and India, where the rules of moving money are complex and need very careful attention due to local regulation, laws and tax reasons. We'll also touch on the maritime industry, which is very unique in the way that workforce is spread, calculated and also paid. The other goal of today's session is to give you a clear picture of the challenges, to introduce some solutions that may make those processes somewhat smoother, also to talk about technology. I always join these sessions and everyone always says technology is the driver, technology is the driver, technology is the driver. And here we're here today to kind of give you some insight as to what technologies are around and available that can solve some of these kind of backdated problems with payments. So to get started today, what we want to do is dive into the world of global workforce payments. And we're actually going to start off with a poll question. So Mark, if you could initiate the poll for us, that would be great.
Excellent. Okay, so for our attendees, on a scale of 1 to 10, how complex would you say is the process of paying your global workforce? Is it A, 1 to 3, B, 4 to 6, C, 7 to 9, or D, 10 or more? So give everyone a short time here and we'll see what we get from your audience. As you see the results coming in, guys, anything that's surprising or jumps out at you?
good to see that there's some challenges. Like 7 to 9 looks like it's the highest percentage so far. So I think it's great. I can see in the chat, wished you had an option for not currently having a global payroll solution. So great call out. Definitely put your point in we'll call it 0 to 3, rather than 1 to 3. So we'll call it 0 so we can include you. We don't want to include,
Yeah,
not include one.
which we could say that the 1 to 3 are people with not a global workforce. At least that would help us. Saying that actually people who do fast-facing challenge.
For sure. I suppose the other part is that is, even if you don't have a global workforce, is how do you find that solution, right? Are you finding it easy today? Is it something that even you think about today? Is the payment element just something that's done rather than something that's seen as a strategic part of your payroll process?
It looks like our results have stopped coming in, guys. So here's your final results, and then I'll give it back over to you.
Awesome. So it looks 35%, 7 to 9 in terms of complexity. So it looks like a good chunker in the top 3, and of course the bottom element, but I'm not going to try and do maths and embarrass myself on the fly, but heavy percentage is in the upper half for sure. Awesome. We'll move on to the next slide now. So what we just wanted to do is talk about the overall processing, talk about kind of how things are working today and what that means. So as we all know, we're well into 2024. Crazy. I know it feels like yesterday it was 2022 and 2023, and I don't know how everyone else does it, but I still feel that I'm writing 2023 in emails. So crazy, but we're well into 2024. Yet many organizations still rely on manual inputs for payroll and payments, whether that be Excel driven, whether that be manually keying in data, so manually keying in payment information into banking accounts, whether that be into files or anything like that. This approach is hugely time consuming and also has a lot of kind of issues with human error, right? Ultimately, we're all in a world, or we're all in a space where we want to move away from as much human intervention as possible. And all of these kind of issues, errors, or potential fraud risks are causing downstream impacts on our businesses. So these are some of the hurdles that we obviously see day to day and kind of see amongst our customers. Is one very common method for payments is bank files. So many of you that use global infrastructures or even local infrastructures will be familiar with the term bank file. And when you actually break down a bank file, it's a very, very archaic and a very backwards way of processing payments. It is a file that consumes PII data, or has PII data, so people's personal banking information, that is transferred often not directly to a bank, often via multiple systems through multiple different teams into a payment mechanism. So there are a number of manual issues, manual processes, as I keep mentioning. Another common hurdle is siloed systems. So often payroll and payment processes are handled separately within the organization, away from just the technology you're using to calculate. There is often HR, finance, payroll, people, all sorts of different teams that are involved in the process, further complicating matters. Also, this provides a lack of standardization. One of the key things that we see a lot of organizations come into the market to do is increase standardization, and they split payroll and payments. I always say, if you walk down the street and speak to people and you could explain or ask them to define what payroll is, would you split the payment element from the calculation? And most people say no. Yet so many businesses across the globe do that because that's just what we know, right? It's what we're used to. It's what we kind of have done for many, many years. Also, the element of tracking regulations. So regulation is an ever-evolving thing. So as we know, tax laws and how payments have to be paid are often changing. So in the UK, you now have to use a full name to process a payment. In France, you have to pay exactly to the payee of your recipient, and you cannot pay no longer to a joint account. So for example, there's many, many different examples of that. When it comes to paying workers globally, manual work persists throughout each pay cycle. And this manual approach is slow, risky, error prone, and has lack of cost efficiency. Moving on to the next slide. So global corporations operating in 50 countries have on average over 850 bank accounts. Conscious that this is an incredibly incredibly dramatic example, especially for some of you that are using only one country. This is a huge kind of far-fetched potential quote, but this is also a huge reason why other tech companies have evolved. Can you imagine managing 850 bank accounts within a business? I don't know. I use maybe one or two on a personal level, and that's stressful enough. So having this many business bank accounts where you're maintaining cash and all sorts of things is definitely a challenge for the global business.
Yeah, and also to highlight, Jonny, like all these bank accounts also require you to open generally legal entity. So also having this many bank accounts and dealing with every single country also have like some legal cost and additional overhead that people don't always consider when thinking about just opening a bank account. So, and we can cover some of these more in details now from this slide. So when it comes to data handling and the management of these accounts, so one thing we see quite often is people entering wrong data inputs. And I can tell you, working from the banking on the banking side previously, like payments, repair processes, etc., is also one of the most costly operation within banks as well. So that's really something that has been burdening the banking industry for decades. So also now making sure that we get the right inputs and the right data for your payments to go through is also key to the success of your payroll cycle. So I guess you all have been struggling from time to time to get the daily information right from employees. So that's also one thing that need to be streamlined and improved to operate payments more smoothly globally. And all these payment details additionally vary across the world. So you cannot consider, because in the US, you will deal with an ACH payment, you will get a routing number and a bank account. In Europe, you will get a SEPA and an IBAN. So all of these will be quite differently and not standardized around the globe. So it's easier to get a platform that will allow you to have a global view with all the requirements for every single countries. Then another challenge is that from time to time you will get discrepancies between your payroll data and your payment data. So depending on all these bank files are generated, etc., you may end up with differences between the data that you will be processing, which can lead to erroneous payments. Then Jonny already mentioned that one, but when it comes to data security, when you're dealing with a payment file, you may end up having this file on your laptop, on a shared folder, etc., and you're putting your company at risk of sharing confidential data, especially as salary information is normally something quite critical within companies. You don't want this to end up with every single employee, within the press, etc. So you really want to have control over this data. So the fact that you don't deal with files anymore and you don't transit for this kind of critical information through unsecured space will make a more safer environment, and all of this data will be processed on a single platform and nothing will get out of it. So you will not have the burden of managing the data securely anymore. So I'm not sure if you want to add anything, Jonny, on this topic.
No, I think you're 100% right. Like ultimately, people's PII data is more important than ever, right? And data security elements that come alongside that, the risks of potential leaking that information is huge. And in payroll, you have access to so much personal information. The security of that is absolutely critical. The other element to that is not only kind of the capturing of that data and the storing of it, is the actual accuracy, right? So you mentioned, Jonathan, the different elements of payments within each country. So SEPA in one market, Gyro in Singapore, the ACH market in the US, the BACS market in the UK. There's a huge amount of different payment mechanisms, but all of that means is also there's a huge amount of differing bank account detail requirements. So how many digit IBAN do you need? How many account number sort code digits do you need? All of that is incredibly complex. Each country has its own set of rules, and it also has its own set of kind of timeframes associated with that. So it's really important that you have a knowledge base to provide that information and understand what information you require country to country. But the second part is that not only the provider that you're using captures that data in a secure way, but also validates that the data you're receiving is correct. I'm sure I'm not gonna. This joke is kind of going to ring true for many of you on this call, but it will never fail to amaze me how many employees input their bank details incorrectly. I still to this day don't understand how and why anyone doesn't want to get paid and doesn't want to give their bank details correctly. But it happens all of the time. So this is a key thing again that we are trying, well, that the industry is trying to change with technology.
Yeah, correct. And you have having countries doing investment to solve that problem. So if we look in Australia now with NPP, for example, employee could get a payment directly with an email address or phone number. So hopefully this initiative at country level will solve some of these global problems. So it's something that most of the industry, at least in payments, is working on, because data validation is a key problem. So if you could even bypass that with initiative like the one in Australia, that would be amazing.
Yeah, we can see in the chat straight away that there's a few people that have had this. I always make the joke to when I talk to kind of other people and other customers is I promise you, if you guys want to pay me, I will make sure that I give you my bank details correctly every single time. Right? It's still, as I said, it amazes me that people input that data incorrectly, but ultimately it's on the vendor to also provide that proactive validation. So I know that obviously there's a lot of sharing with third parties with Payroll. I can see in the chat again, a number of people were tied into third party vendors on the back of their current use cases. Ultimately, the data can't be transferred between multiple places. There has to be a system of record, and that system of record has to provide you with that proactive validation. This is a standard thing. I think, again, outside of the payroll industry, I'm not sure how much this is known, but ultimately, one key thing I would say is payroll doesn't stop at the calculation. A successful payroll cycle stops when you've paid your employees on time, you've paid your taxes, you've paid everything like that. And the payment element is so important. We all talk about global payroll, how to increase data visibility, how to increase the process, how to make it more automated, all of that kind of stuff. Some of the key fundamentals, like processing payments, are often forgotten. It's one of those things that's just done, right? If you go and speak to an employee outside of your payroll org, they just would assume it's done. But it's a hugely challenging process with a huge amount of manual effort and a huge amount of cross-functional team involvement as well. It's a key part that where you need HR, finance, payroll, all sorts of people like that to work together very quickly in a very secure way. So it's a really important kind of topic that we're driving into today as well. I'm sure I spent far too long on this slide, but I think it's some really good talking points and some really good notes in the chat as well. Moving on to our second poll.
Yes, indeed, gentlemen. So for our audience, how comfortable do you feel with the compliance regulations in the country you operate in? A, very comfortable. I know these laws like the back of my hand. B, pretty confident. I have some knowledge gaps here and there, but nothing detrimental. C, not too confident. I definitely lack some key information. Or D, it's all gibberish to me. So let's give everyone a short time and we'll see what kind of responses we get. I'm kind of fond of the it's all gibberish to me part, but that's my personal take on that one.
Looks like, again, the two middle seem to be the kind of key. I think, again, the other part to this is, and this is probably going to be quite a long question to answer in the chat, but where do you guys get those regulation updates? Is that proactively by your provider? Is that downstream from kind of networks like this where you can talk to your peers? But again, where are you getting that information is a good thing to think about as well, because it's not only about how you kind of understand it and then you can portray it, it's about how actively are you getting given that information to make those changes ahead of those changes being made, so to speak.
It looks like your answers are starting to slow down. So I think we'll move on to the static slide and you can see your final results, and I'll leave the comments over to you all.
Yeah, and
Awesome.
maybe one of the question will have been as well to include when you discuss about compliance and regulation. So it's one thing to send the net salary, but are you confident with your process to send authority payment, taxes, etc.? Again, you're comfortable with the country you operate in, but how if you need to extend to one new country tomorrow? How comfortable are you with the information you will get from your provider or however you do that?
Awesome. I can see from the chat as well, a lot of the responses around networks like these and other things. I'm a huge advocate for learning and learning peer-to-peer learning in events like this, right? Ultimately, we all need to learn from each other. We're all within one industry, and it's an absolute key here. So moving on to the cost control element. So this is a key part as well. So as we kind of said, payments are complex, but there's also a lot of the kind of more basic elements that go alongside payments. So it's excessive bank fees and FX rates. Moving money across the globe is incredibly expensive and incredibly difficult to do country to country. There's also a number of other key things such as lack of visibility. So if you have multiple bank accounts, so the example we had earlier of 850 accounts, I think it was. How do you maintain all of those bank accounts and how do you maintain all of that stuff? I mean, Jonathan, you've got plenty of experience in this space. Any thoughts here?
Yeah, clearly. So, okay, on the FX rate and the bank fee, especially depending on the size of your organization, it's always difficult to get good rates. And especially if you're dealing with multiple countries and multiple regions, you may not be able to work with one bank. So you would have to maintain multiple relationships, which also add to the cost because you would have to learn and operate and get contracts, etc., with multiple banks. That's generally not an easy things to do. The lack of visibility. So if you operate with multiple banks, and even some global banks will not have the same portal all around the globe. So being an expat, I can tell you, like, even staying with the same global banks through all the countries I've traveled, I moved to, I always ended up having a different application, which was not great. So I would assume it's the same on the corporate space, and you will get different corporate application, even if you remain with the same bank. And then you will have like a low return on your team effort because all this learning of manual process, different application, etc., may not be reusable across different regions. So you would have to get your team to relearn every single time the processes, and they could have spent the effort on more valuable tasks than just tracking all these bank accounts and making sure you have enough funds on all of them, right?
Agreed. The other thing I would say is I always have this conversation, and Jonathan, I'm sure you do too, of local versus global funding. So do I want to send you my local cash, which means you can process the payments, or am I going to send you all of this centralized funds in one market? FX has this kind of ugly connotation with it. People kind of hear the word FX and shake in their kind of steps, but it doesn't have to be. When you actually break down the process of what's going on in terms of your cash, the movement of data, the transferring of information between teams, sometimes the more basic route of sending a global funds request or sending global amounts is what's best for the business as well. So all of these things can be super ugly and they can be a definite cost control. But as I said, it's all about going into the detail for sure.
Yeah, and I think people have been traumatized with FX rate and bank fee in the past. I think one of the things, if we look at innovation over the last decades, fintech have changed the game there. So now FX rate has been more and more transparent. So indeed, I agree with you. From time to time, simplifying your flow and going to do FX with the fintech partners, etc., may be simpler than managing directly in-house. It used to be something really daunting and scary, where the fees were actually quite high and not transparent at all. While I believe now the entire industry have moved to get like more transparency, as it was something that the banks were lacking of, and has been forced to come into play with the fintechs moving along.
Agreed. Just moving on to the next slide. So, according to the IRS, 33% of employers make payroll errors, costing billions of dollars. So again, a huge amount of money here that goes on, a huge amount of issues. We had an example in the UK, also away from kind of this stat, of a major mainstream bank actually paying staff a number of days late as well. Payroll ties and touches so many different aspects of a business. It's the single biggest liability that any business has. It also touches so many different parts of the business, like people, well-being, all sorts of things like that. All of these buzzwords that we hear day in, day out from our employers, from the market, from our friends and family, all sorts of things like that. But ultimately, nothing has more of an effect on your well-being than being paid on time. So I always say why is payments not a strategic part of the business and the payroll decision-making process? There was a Deloitte report that I read yesterday from, I think it was 2021 or 2022, that said the highest percentage of KPI that businesses have to report on is their accuracy of pay. So I think it was about 89% based on the Deloitte report. So a huge amount of people have to report on that key fundamental error. Yet people are still doing things in a very old-fashioned way via bank files, transferring data manually, or even keying in bank details. I'm not going to make people do this and put their hands up now, but I'm sure if I was to ask people how many of us on this call have inputted bank details to pay people's salaries before, I'd imagine a fairly high percentage of us would put our hands up. Ultimately, the world is changing. This is obviously a huge part of the payroll cycle, but as I said, I always call it the ugly duckling of payroll. It's kind of everyone just expects it to be done. No one really kind of has ownership of it. It sits in between HR, finance, and payroll, but it is such an important part that has a huge bearing on the overall company culture, well-being, and the process of payroll. Okay. What we're going to do now is delve into a couple of real-life examples, show you the complexity, show you some of the markets, and we'll also kind of caveat this into other countries as well. Conscious that there is a number of people that said they don't have global scope, so we want to make sure we're trying to cater for everyone on this session as much as possible. But here are some real-life examples that we wanted to drive into with Brazil, India, and the maritime sector, just in case anyone's not good with flags. I just wanted to triple check that. So I'm going to move into Brazil initially. So as you can imagine, a hugely complex market, one of the fastest growing economies in the world, which has a hugely complex regulatory landscape for payroll and workforce payments. So from our side and from a lot of people's knowledge, payroll payments have to be paid from the local employing entity's local bank account directly to the workers. So very complex, lots of local pieces that have to be taken into consideration. And compliance with these regulations is essential to avoid legal issues and penalties. Jonathan, anything you want to add to this?
Yeah, because when we deal with Brazil, you will also consider that you have to deal with FX. And I was reading earlier comments that earlier FX can take days. And that's also something from the past, right? FX these days are not generally done through FX and through settlement. Generally, you can find provider that can offer you also same-day settlement. And then if we look at Brazil in particular, they have new settlement methods, especially on the local side, like for the employee to receive the money. There are many alternatives these days in Brazil. I think the name is Pico. Correct me if I'm wrong, Jonny. But basically, you have these new wallets. So it's something common all across the world, especially in the new world. So if we look at China, in Africa included, Brazil, more and more countries are moving toward wallet payment, and Brazil is one of them. So that's really something to keep in mind in the coming decades. I will see more and more of these developing countries getting salaries paid directly to wallets and bypass a bit the traditional banking experience that we are used to in the West.
Agreed. To kind of take it further with Brazil, high taxation rates is also very common, and companies are required to withhold and remit taxes from employee salaries. So incredibly complex. Managing these tax deductions accurately is crucial to avoid compliance issues for payroll and for the business. And operating in Brazil requires an understanding of local culture, amongst other things like the Portuguese language, and so on. Miscommunications or cultural misunderstandings are common too, and can impact the payment process drastically. So I think to add on to what Jonathan said, the employee payment world that we live in, this challenger bank cycle, has changed the FX and payments world forever. Now we all have the ability to consume pay quicker than ever. We have the ability to pay people quicker than ever. So now corporates and banks and other solutions are being pulled alongside this. So obviously we're used to kind of maybe the business leading the personal, but what we're seeing in the payment space is very much the personal leading the business in terms of that banking environment. Anything more to add on Brazil, Jonathan?
No, I think you covered it all. Maybe the security concern we didn't cover yet, but also like in terms of IT, cybersecurity, the withholding tax that you have to prepare, like how you will, since you need to hire someone and you need to have an account in the country. If you don't have your own, you will need to trust someone to do the payment on your behalf and get access to your account. So it's a country with a lot of security concerns when it comes to managing payments there.
Agreed. Let's take a short flight, I suppose. Definitely not a short flight, over to India, another huge powerhouse economy and a huge growing market, which I'm sure a lot of you with Global Workforce will have a number of employees in India. It's a hugely diverse workforce with employees from various states and regions having different kind of payroll requirements and compliance rules. So as you know, as I'm sure many of you know, each region based in India has its own payroll calculation method, own tax kind of receipts, and so on. So it's an incredibly complex market. India also requires employers to make various statutory deductions from employee salaries, including income tax, provident fund contributions, professional tax, to name a few. So again, another hugely complex market for those payments. The other element to that is the actual due dates of those payments. So this is something we haven't really delved into yet. We've talked about payments very kind of high level. With employee net payments, taxes, and so on, there's also a huge amount of variable due dates. So it could be the end of the current month. You might pay people in arrears or slightly in advance. You could be paying tax 15th of the following month, the 20th of the following month, quarterly, yearly, who knows? All of those have to be managed somewhere, right? All of those different due dates have to be managed somewhere. And it's incredibly complex country to country. If you think about a standard country where you may have tax, social security, and net payments, so 3 pay elements. Imagine doing that for 10 countries. You're quickly looking at 30 pay elements. And that's to do very, very basic payroll with no benefits tied, no additional deductions. It's an incredibly high amount of touch. So again, I see someone in the chat mention that they had a 3-step approval process or was looking at entering details, then they have a second person to review and verify. Again, if you think about those pay elements and you have, say, 10 countries with 3 pay elements, plus those 2 people doing checking for uploading data, one, then checking for the payments, you're looking at 100, 150 steps per payroll cycle to do. So that's a huge amount of manual work and a huge amount of people kind of touching payroll. Back to India, because I know I went off on a bit of an angle there, so apologies.
One thing on India. Yeah, for India, what you could add as well is like the regulatory framework in India is highly complex. So compared to many countries, the Central Bank of India is being really avant-garde, I would say. They really tried to get the regulatory framework to support a lot of the new technologies and the new fintechs, but that also make it really difficult to navigate because they also want to make sure that the currency doesn't get depreciated. So they have really high control in terms of funds that can get in and get out of the country and who can operate in India. So it's one of the countries where you get difficulties to get your money out most of the times. Normally, to pay your employee, if you're a US-based company, a base company paying employee in India, that should be fairly easier. But if you have revenue generated in India, to get this revenue back to the US is slightly more complicated. And that's where you would end up having to deal with a lot more regulation and find the right partner to do that with.
I agree. And we're talking about traditional payment methods here, right? We're talking about a standard wire transaction or a local transfer directly in market. We haven't even talked about how employees actually want to consume their pay. So India is a huge market for kind of the challenger bank model is, do you want to receive your money to your phone? Do you want to receive it to a virtual card? Do you want it in a more traditional kind of prepaid card? How do you want to consume your pay is also a huge question. We as employees, or we as people, sorry, I should say, away from employees, we as people are changing the way we consume pay. Hence the likes of Venmo being created. Hence the like of Revolut in the EMEA market and many, many others. There's hundreds of examples. All of that is changing the way that we use our kind of disposable income. When is that change going to happen to the way that we consume our generic or our more formal employee pay for our employer? Right now, the kind of more payroll businesses are focused on those more traditional methods. But again, as I said, kind of just another question to put out there for you to think about is the world going to change in the terms of how we process those payments and where employees consume that too?
Yeah, and we could see like India is one of the leader in that space, especially on these new methods, because people have to realize like people in the West tend to believe like everybody owns a bank account. I forgot the numbers. I got them a few years ago. But in India, you had roughly more than half the population, from what I remember, that didn't even own a bank account. So it was a massive challenge for the authorities there to actually get access to banking opportunities and to have a way to spend money electronically to everyone in India. So that was a massive challenge for the country, and that's something you see similar in China with Alipay, etc., and all these wallets being created. So India is also leading the way, trying to get access to payments to most a big part of the population was excluded so far. So it's part of the challenges we don't really see in the West, but that actually like being solved by countries like India. So that's a really interesting market to look at, because you still have a big disparities between people. I think your employee will be based in India, will most likely have a bank account, etc., and be on the higher part of society, while you will see still a massive part of the population over there not having access to this service. So looking for alternative payment methods is really key for the market and for the country overall.
Agreed. And I think you're touching on a really good point is how can you attract talent, right? Payroll's role, as I keep saying, is so important. But obviously for the wider business goals, it's about attracting new and evolving talent as well. So how can payroll provide a stepping stone to become not only such a value add to the wider business from a service perspective and how it offers that on a strategic element around data and analytics and things, but how can it also become an enabler to hire the best in talent with regards to how you consume pay? That will definitely be coming, and I think the world has changed so much. We all used to get cash or checks or anything like that, and I know many around the world still do get checks and cash, but ultimately, as you rightly said, Jonathan, there are changes coming afoot in that space.
Yeah, and I think that's a good transition to the next topic, actually, which is the maritime, which come with requirement for new technologies. So the maritime industry is basically a widely spread. You have a lot of type of culture. The fareware are living overseas, they're traveling all around the world. So for them, having a card issue in the US or anywhere in the world will always end up being difficult for them, because they will have to pay like a lot of FX on all the spendings they do. A lot of maybe employee like coming from the Philippines or to other countries and need to send some money back home, etc. So they come with really specific needs that we haven't seen coming from many industry before. But to highlight some of them, for example, in the maritime industry, people want to split salaries. So let's say they want to keep a small amount of cash for their day spending when they're on the boat and when they reach shore. And then they will want to send a part of the salary back to their home country. So it means that we'll end up with more than one payment for a single employee, and you will have to split these. And then that add even more complexity to the payments, because you will have to deal with different countries, etc. Another one that we have seen for the maritime industry is the request to get a credit card for the employee, because these guys are living on boats, on ships, and when they reach shore, they will need to be able to do their local spendings, go for dinner, buy some stuff over there. And to do that, they will face high cost generally on the credit cards. So on the consumer space, we have seen like companies coming across with cheaper rates credit cards. But then we are looking at ways to provide it as an employee perks, where the companies could be able to issue a card to this maritime employee and then provide them with cheaper rates, the ability to split the bill with other colleagues, etc. So in the maritime industry nowadays, they're really looking at adding additional financial services to the employee rather than just being limited to just paying the salary. So it's a really interesting space as people really want to get more and more services for their employees directly and not expecting to get financial companies to provide that for them.
Totally agree. And again, no, I agree. And just to kind of, again, recap what we said, it's all about how can we make payroll as strategic as possible. I kind of sit on a number of these with my colleague Ian Giles, who many of you may know or have heard of or have seen on LinkedIn, who's a great thought leader within this space. One key thing that he always brings up is how can we get payroll a seat at the table? How can we get a chief payroll officer a thing? How can we make that happen? And it's all about adding kind of new ways and new value to the organization. And one way that we definitely think can be had is around this employee engagement element, around employee attraction, around kind of also automating this process. As I said, we've all probably been there and all had examples of employees not being paid on time or a tax being paid late and having huge penalties and fines. So it's all about finding a more automated and a slicker solution for that problem. Okay. Going to move on to what's the solution to the jigsaw puzzle. Quite a tongue twister if you try and say it quite quickly. So I'm glad I did that quite well. But before we kind of delve deeper into what's the solution, we're going to kind of move on to our final poll. So over to Mark again to introduce that one.
Indeed. And you did well on that, Jonny, by the way. So for our audience, how important would you say payment visibility is for your global workforce operations? Would it be A, extremely important, lack of payment visibility keeps me up at night? B, pretty important, I'd like to have a better idea of how and when payments are being processed? C, a little important, I guess, but it tends to slip my mind when there are other more important things to deal with? Or D, not that important, as long as I know that the payment got there, I'm happy. So we'll give your audience a short time on this one, and we'll see just how important this really is for everybody. Kind of taps into what you guys were just talking about, as a matter of fact.
For sure.
Yeah, it's good to see because that's actually a global problem in payments, not only related to payroll. And I think payment visibility and tracking is one of the things keeping the entire financial world awake, at least people working in payments. But that has been one of the challenges for the last 2 decades, I would say, that people try to resolve. So there's been great improvement over the last years. I think if people here who are working in the industry for more than 10 years can definitely admit that cross-border payment has been at least 10x, if not 20 times faster than what it was. So, and normally if you work with the right provider, you're supposed to get more information that you ever did before. So that's one of the things that has really been changing over the last decade. So I'm glad to see that actually still a problem and that people are still looking for solution for that one.
Indeed. Looks like we've got our answers pretty much static at this point, so I'll flip it back over to the static slide. You can make any last minute comments and I'll give it back over to you.
Oh, the numbers just changed. I had a great talk track for over 90% then, but just below 90% of you has said pretty important or extremely important for that. As I keep saying, ultimately paying your staff is the one of the key roles of payroll, right? It's paying people on time every time and without fail. It's one of those things that we assume away from our day-to-day career. We assume that it's a given that we are all paid on time every time, but that doesn't do any justice to the complexities that you guys on this call have to go through to get that done month in, month out. So even if it's a global or local issue, I keep seeing in the chat again on a local level, but again, we assume that payments go well. So I look back in the chat earlier on, a number of people mentioned they use third parties. The moment you use third parties, you lose visibility, right? We assume that people have made those payments on time. We assume that they've paid the tax on time. There is that kind of no single control step or control element that really gives you comfort that that's been done. And if it hasn't been done, there can be huge adverse effects, adverse media if you've paid people are late. There can be obviously impacts on your overall culture, as I've mentioned. And then if you go into the taxes, social security elements, you pay those late, the fines are absolutely astronomical. Hopefully none of you have had to live through any of those fines, but again, paying on time for all of these pay elements, not just paying people, is incredibly important for the wider business. So moving on to kind of here's what you'll need in terms of the question of, so what's the solution to the jigsaw puzzle? So thought it was difficult saying it once, so I thought I'd go back and give it a go. So let's get into some of the solutions to all of these problems. What we wanted to do is talk about the importance of having a platform that is licensed and regulated to handle funds globally. Within the payroll sector, again, it's not been a focus as to how to process these payments, and there's often been the partner model that everyone runs through. So they will use a number of partners that are in the fintech space that ultimately just process payments. They do not understand the complexity of payroll. They have not built in the complexities. They have not built in the things like how you send the payment for purpose codes. They haven't looked into the local regulations, or they're not up to date on what the local regulations are on how and when payments are due to be made. All of those things are a given and should be something you expect from your global providers, but are not quite there yet. When it comes to payment rails, again, it's absolutely crucial to have custom-made rails that are optimized by cross-border workforce payments, which is built on top of kind of tier one bank infrastructures. So that's a key thing that we again do, is ensure that we're using key tier one bank infrastructures to process those payments. Anything you want to add here, Jonathan?
Yeah, I would say that working with key banks is also important in terms of security for your funds. So not all partners are made equals, and I would highly suggest to double check where your funds are stored, especially when everything is green and yellow and everything goes well, then no problems. But then the days you start to have issues, it's important that your funds are segregated and stored with serious partners. We could see like in the US last year, like some of the banks got issued in California, etc. So I would highly suggest to make sure that even if you work with fintechs, that you make sure to know which banking partners are behind them to make sure your funds are safe. And then, like you said, Jonny, it's not, I think the entire fintech world and payments has been trying to focus on getting faster, while actually for payroll payments, you care about being fast, but that's not your main criteria. When you do payroll payments, you know at which date your payment need to reach your employee. You will do your payroll cycle upfront, etc., and you know by which time the payments need to reach. So you are not looking for absolute speed, which is what the industry has been focusing, but you are, however, looking at making sure the right amount is credited, that no one is taking any fees along the way, and you are looking at making sure that the payments land. So for you, 100% accuracy and making sure that the payments always land is more important, I would say, than actually like looking for absolute speed. While most of the fintech industry today is actually looking at big numbers and focusing on getting like all these payments with the famous 999% on time. But what about the 0.01%? That's where you will get issues with your employees that don't land on time. So I would say there's kind of a niche now to get payments done with a land date and make sure the right amount has been credited to the employee, which is different than what the focus for most fintech is today.
Agreed. One of the keywords that we always hear is visibility. I want more visibility. I want more visibility. Right. And how do you do that? So I've heard again a number of third parties mentioned, and Jonathan, you rightly touched on the idea of kind of alternative methods such as trust accounts or third-party accounts or third-party vendors to process these payments. And what visibility do you have as an employer and then an employee to see where you are? So, for example, you send your third party the funds for them to make the payments. How do you know that that money's been arrived? Without a system, without a platform, without a technology layer that shows you that in direct in there, so within kind of a wallet mechanism or something like that, you again are assuming and hoping that that payment has been credited and processed. So the need for technology that kind of doesn't just stop at the calculation and the generation of a pay stub or a pay slip, it needs to go through to the end-to-end payment cycle too. So that's kind of why things like virtual wallets, which I know we are a big pioneer for, are offering. So workforce wallets to your kind of employer, but also down to your employee level. So I can see in the chat a number of people saying around early payments and people being paid early or drawing upon their pay early, things like that. So we're all moving into a world where we're looking at instant payments or same day payments or all of these things. What employees want is to be paid on pay date. And what payroll do not want to do is to be called every 5 seconds going, when's my payment going to credit? When's my payment going to credit? When's my payment going to credit? Because it's a difficult answer to give. And I saw it perfectly in the chat is you can't control the banking credit times. But ultimately, what we're starting to see is SEPA is traditionally a next day transaction, is those payments are still being processed the day before your due date and everyone's receiving that money. Nice surprise. Not saying that I don't like being paid a day early, 100% I do, but it's still creating that inconsistency and it's still a SLA failure for a number of providers like ourselves. So all of those things are absolutely key as we kind of evolve, and utilizing a service that works based on value date. Again, another key feature around what we deliver is working off of that value date mechanism. So actually processing a payment based off of a value date. So rather than working forward, so thinking about I need to issue a payment today, so it credits tomorrow, you work backwards from the value date that you want the payment to credit. So the value date is X and I need the payment to hit then, and this is where I then need to send that payment. Okay, that's another change that we're trying to bring to the market, or the market is trying to bring to itself. But also the integration to HR, finance, tech stacks, all of those kind of key things that we all know and love. Integrations are key. Having one central source of data, one source of truth is absolutely critical for any growing business, but any business fundamentally as well. Anything else you want to add, Jonathan?
No, I think you covered it all. Maybe we can talk a bit about funding as well for this, because once you work with a land date, then it gives you the opportunity first to create your payment upfront, and then you also get an idea on how much you need to fund. So especially when you're dealing with FX, what you want to see is at some point like how much USD you need to send to your partner, and all of these will vary over time. So it's also important to build technology to be able to estimate how much USD equivalent you will need to provide to pay out all your employees around the world. Because let's say if you are short for one employee, like just even a few dollars, and your payment doesn't go through, it means someone doesn't get paid. So it's also important to build with this kind of technology to make sure you can estimate how much money you need to fund these accounts for the payments to get out. And that's not an easy task, to be honest, to get accurate on this one.
Agreed. It's all about providing a solution that allows HR, payroll, people, I don't want to exclude anyone here, but ultimately, it's all about providing a solution that connects all of your internal teams within one technology layer. To make payroll effectively work, you have to have payroll, HR, and finance as three key functions working together seamlessly and well. Right now, payroll, I think, and HR work very, very well, and finance are there as well in terms of kind of GL integrations, finance tech stacks, and all sorts of things like that. But again, payments seem to be the forgotten ugly duckling that no one really wants to touch. I don't know whether it's because of the complexity, because of how important it is, but there is a huge amount of strategy that goes to making an effective payroll payment cycle. Again, looking at the chat, I'm amazed that I'm not amazed, but it always seems to ring true with me that we all assume that payments are made on time and well. We all assume that these things are done and we take for granted that it works. But it's absolutely critical that we all know how this works and we know that these things are going to work successfully.
And looking at the chat, I want to add one thing. So I saw like someone was commenting that employee being earlier is not really an issue. And I would say, like, same as you, I think from the employee point of view, it's not an issue. But then let's say from the company point of view, if you are 3-4 days early every single month, especially in the high interest rate market that we are today, that's actually a liability to the company. So that can cost you money at the end of the day if you pay the employee continuously early. That can be some interest rate that you will miss and have a cost to the overall operation of the company. So 1 or 2 days, I agree with you, not a big deal. But then when we start to talk with really early payments, if you are not sure and you just decide to blast your payment 5 or 6 days earlier, and then it ends up being instant, you could then delay them by 3 or 4 days and benefit from an interest rate during that time. So that's valid for really large organizations. So this kind of optimization can be really worth it when we are speaking about really huge numbers.
Agreed. So just to kind of recap everything we said and what we see as the right state of global workforce payments. So as we mentioned previously, guaranteed land date. So working back from that land date and processing payments on payday is critical. I know that banks can obviously do what they want to an extent, but ultimately making sure that we have the infrastructure to provide customers with that comfort that when we say payments are going to land on a specific day, they do. It is not acceptable for you to accept a provider to say we receive it early or that's the bank crediting. There are mechanisms to get around it, hence the land date mechanism that we've developed. The second thing is that global coverage. Again, I keep mentioning the global complexities of how you process payroll payments. It's very, very different from the US, which is state by state, versus France, Germany, the UK, which is incredibly different. So how you navigate that global landscape is an absolute key thing. And again, also providing that guaranteed compliance. We're seeing a number of fintechs move into this space that are more transactional. It's all about using a specific need or specific product for a specific need. Ultimately, having all of this is really, really important. Having a proactive partner that understands the local legislations, understands how payroll payments have to be made and how they have to be how they have to appear in people's bank accounts, again, is absolutely critical. So as we know, or as many of you I'm sure will know, in the Euro SEPA region, there was a change where you have to process payments with a purpose code. You now have to send payments with the purpose code of salary to ensure your employees are receiving that money and it's classified as a salary payment, which will allow them to apply for things like mortgages and things like that. So it's all of those more granular details that mean for a successful payment, not just the transaction to say, here you go, good luck, here's your payment, great, have a great weekend and enjoy it. There's all of that element. And then there's the transparency piece. The third point down here is that liability. It's all about using a party or using a vendor that takes liability for their actions. Ultimately, if you're using someone for a service, what you shouldn't be doing is settling for a subpar service. So with us, again, with Papaya, we have that full liability service that is contracted within our contract. And it's a key part of what we believe in is, one, this is a zero tolerance game. Everything has to go through successfully. But two, you should hold your vendor to account. I know we're kind of at time, so I just wanted to kind of quickly recap and say thank you, everyone, for your time. It was great, and thank you so much for your kind of messages in the chat. We really appreciate it. It made our lives as presenters a hell of a lot easier, so we really appreciate all of your time. Thank you.
We can take one question if you'd like, guys.
Of course.
We can go over a couple minutes. Let's take one. The one question we can slip in here is from Marie. They ask, why are manual processes in payroll payments still so prevalent?
Do you want to take that, Jonathan? I'll let you go.
Yeah, I think it's mostly new solutions have come out rather recently. So it's still like process that's still in place today. And it's also the cost of change, I believe, and getting someone within the organization to drive the change. So we often see people that are not aware that new solution exists. And then it just takes some effort as well to migrate to a new solution, and people are content with the solutions they have today. What we can say that generally once people embrace the change, they're happy once the migration is over, and the day-to-day life is made way easier. So I'm not sure if you want to add anything, Jonny, but I would say for me it's more inertia than anything else.
I think, yeah, I agree. I think it's we don't know what we don't know, right? Ultimately, this is something that we're all used to just paying in a traditional mechanism like a file. There hasn't been technologies that are specifically built for purposes like this. So that's what companies are trying to do. That's what the innovation of technology is trying to do. And I think it's ultimately comes back to kind of making sure that we are paying people accurately is key.
Well, excellent, guys. Wonderful webinar. And as we are at the top of the hour, I just want to thank you too for an excellent presentation, incredibly useful information, and a webinar. And we want to thank Papaya Global for sponsoring this process.